Mrs. Peterson, a retired Air Force veteran, was skipping her medication because she couldn't afford it. But when her neighbor organized a charity concert to help, the HOA tried to shut it down with threats and lawsuits. Leading the charge was Jameson, a power-hungry HOA president who would rather see a sick veteran suffer than lose control over his little suburban kingdom. But when the community fought back, the concert became more than just music. It turned into a revolution. And you won't believe the final blow that sent Jameson and his cronies packing, proving that justice always finds a way to win. Mrs. Peterson was the kind of woman who had seen more hardship than most, but she never let it show. A retired Air Force veteran, she had served for over 20 years, giving her youth, her strength, and, ultimately, her husband to a country that now seemed to have forgotten her. She lived alone in a small, well-kept house at the edge of the neighborhood, her only company an old golden retriever named Duke. Her pension barely covered the essentials, and with crippling arthritis making even the simplest tasks a struggle, she should have been getting the best medical care available. But she wasn't. Her medical bills had become so unmanageable that she'd started skipping doses of her medication. Not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice. And when her neighbor, Tyler, found out, something in him snapped. The planned Tyler wasn't a hero. He wasn't a millionaire or some big-shot politician who could pull strings and make problems disappear. But he was a musician. Not famous, but well-connected enough to make things happen. He had played in bars, small festivals, even the occasional opening act for bigger names. He knew how to get people together, how to organize an event, how to make noise, literally and figuratively. The idea hit him fast, a charity concert. It was perfect. The city approved everything. He secured a spot in a public park, lined up a solid lineup of performers, and got the support of local businesses. Food trucks signed up, volunteers pitched in, and the community rallied behind Mrs. Peterson. For the first time in a long time, things seemed to be going right. And then the HOA got involved. The confrontation, it happened the day before the concert. Tyler was taping up the last of the flyers when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned just in time to see them approaching, a trio of self-important HOA board members, moving with the smug authority of people who thought their word was law. Mr. Jameson led the charge, his arms crossed over his chest, mouth curled into a condescending smirk. Behind him, his wife Karen radiated disapproval like a furnace, and flanking them both was Bobby, their ever-loyal enforcer, a man whose entire personality revolved around enforcing rules no one actually liked. Jameson didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You really think this is happening?" he scoffed, tilting his head as if the very idea of Tyler pulling off this event was laughable. Tyler didn't even flinch. "It's a charity concert. For a veteran." Karen let out an exaggerated sigh, her arms tightening across her chest. It doesn't matter if it's for veterans, orphans, or sick puppies. This is unacceptable noise, and there are rules." Tyler's jaw tightened. Rules. That was the word they always used. The excuse they hid behind whenever they wanted to control something they had no business controlling. He leveled his gaze at them. "The city approved the event. I have the permits." Jameson shrugged, completely unfazed. "Yeah, well, we didn't approve it." Karen took a step closer, lowering her voice like she was delivering a threat disguised as a warning. "If you don't cancel it, we'll sue." For a moment, Tyler just stared at them, his brain struggling to process the sheer absurdity of the situation. They were threatening legal action over a fundraiser for a disabled veteran's medical bills, a woman who had given her life to serving this country, a woman who had already lost more than they could ever comprehend. The rage that simmered in his chest threatened to boil over, but instead of snapping, he did something else. He smiled. Slowly, deliberately, he tore off another strip of tape and slapped a flyer onto the wall right in front of them. Then, meeting Jameson's glare with unwavering defiance, he said, "Try me." The night after the confrontation, the phone calls started. At first, Tyler thought they were just words of encouragement, neighbors wanting to show their support, checking in, offering last-minute help. And some were. But then came the fear. Some spoke in hushed voices, hesitant, nervous. Others were outright panicked. "Tyler, I want to help, but I got a letter from the HOA. They're threatening fines." I can't afford a lawsuit, man. I have kids. They said they'll revoke our permits if we participate. I'm sorry, I just can't risk it. By midnight, his stomach was twisted into knots. The HOA wasn't just trying to stop the concert. They were going after everyone involved. They had started sending out official-looking letters, dripping with legal jargon and veiled threats. Anyone who donated, anyone who volunteered, anyone who so much as showed up to the event could face consequences, fines, lawsuits, HOA penalties. One by one, volunteers began to drop out. Sponsors started second-guessing their involvement. Even some of the musicians pulled out. Tyler barely slept. And when the morning came, the situation somehow got worse. The envelope was sitting on his doorstep. Plain white, no warning, no return address. Just his name typed neatly across the front. He already knew what it was before he even opened it. A formal legal notice from the HOA. They weren't just threatening to sue anymore. They were actually doing it. The letter demanded the immediate cancellation of the concert and hit him with an accusation so ridiculous it would have been funny if it weren't so infuriating. Creating a public disturbance and violating HOA noise regulations. They were suing him for disrupting the community, the same community that had come together to help a disabled veteran. For a second, he just stood there, gripping the paper so tightly that the edges began to crumple. His pulse pounded in his ears. His jaw clenched so hard it ached. And then, without a second thought, he grabbed his keys and drove straight to Mrs. Peterson's house. Mrs. Peterson's home was always impeccably neat, her porch swept clean, her small front yard lined with the carefully tended flowers she somehow still managed to take care of despite her arthritis. But when she opened the door, she looked tired. She moved slowly, gripping her cane a little tighter than usual as she let him inside. Duke, her aging golden retriever, barely lifted his head from his spot by the couch. She made tea, just like she always did when he visited. But as she set down the cups, Tyler noticed the way her hands trembled slightly. He placed the letter on the table between them. Her eyes flickered to it, then back to him. "They're really doing this?" she asked, her voice quiet, unsure. Tyler nodded. "Yeah," she swallowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. Then just as quickly, she shook her head and let out a tired, bitter laugh. "I fought for this country." She stared down at the tea in her hands, voice thick with something raw, something unspoken. "And they—" She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Tyler's fists clenched, his nails dug into his palms. She had given everything. And now, this was how they repaid her? He took a slow breath, forcing down the fire burning in his chest. Then with quiet, unwavering certainty, he said, "They won't stop us." Tyler didn't cancel the concert. He made it louder. If the HOA thought they could bully the community into silence, they had picked the wrong fight. Every volunteer who backed out, 5 more stepped up. Every sponsor who pulled funding, a local business doubled their donation. The story had spread. What started as a small neighborhood fundraiser had turned into a movement. By the time the day of the event arrived, the park was packed. Families spread out blankets on the grass. Kids ran around with their faces painted red, white, and blue. Veterans, some in full uniform, others in old, worn service jackets, stood near the stage, watching with quiet pride. Tyler stood backstage, looking out at the crowd, feeling a fire in his chest that no HOA threat could extinguish. Then, the band started playing, and the noise roared to life. The music boomed, shaking the ground with the deep bass of defiance. People clapped, cheered, sang along. Every song ended to deafening applause, and each time, the energy only rose higher. Then, Tyler saw him. Jameson, standing at the entrance, clutching his phone like it was a grenade. Karen was at his side, arms folded so tightly across her chest that she looked ready to implode. Bobby hovered behind them, shifting uncomfortably, like even he knew they'd already lost. Tyler didn't need to hear the conversation to know what was happening. They were calling the cops. A ripple of tension moved through the crowd as a squad car pulled up, its lights flashing. 3 officers stepped out. They moved through the sea of people, families, veterans, kids dancing to the music. Their faces were unreadable, but their body language said it all. They had no idea why they were here. Jameson stormed toward them, gesturing wildly at the stage. Karen followed close behind, her voice sharp, slicing through the music. Tyler didn't need to guess what was being said. Noise complaint, illegal gathering, disturbing the peace. The officers listened, nodded, looked around. Then one of them, a tall man with sharp features and a steady gaze, paused. His eyes landed on the front row, where Mrs. Peterson stood. The crowd parted just enough for Tyler to see it happen. The officer's face changed. His expression softened. Then, slowly, he glanced at the other two cops. Something asterisk passed between them. A silent conversation, a decision made in seconds, and then, without a word, they turned around and walked away. No tickets, no arrests, nothing. Just a quiet refusal to enforce HOA's pettiness. The moment the officers were gone, the crowd erupted. Cheers, whistles, pure, unfiltered victory. Karen's face twisted in rage, her skin turning an ugly, blotchy red. "This is not legal," she screeched, barely audible over the applause. Tyler grabbed the mic, his voice strong, his pulse pounding. "You know what's illegal? Blackmail, harassment, trying to silence good people for your own power trip." He let the words hang in the air, let them sink in. Then he smiled. "But it's a good thing we've got plenty of witnesses, huh?" The crowd roared. Jameson went pale, because standing at the edge of the park, held up by hundreds of hands and camera phones, were videos of him, his threats, his emails, his demands, already spreading online. The music kicked back in. The concert continued, and the HOA? They had already lost. By the time the last note faded into the night and the final cheers echoed across the park, the impact of what had happened began to sink in. The concert had been more than just music, more than just a fundraiser. It had been a statement, and it had worked. When the donation totals came in, Tyler could hardly believe his eyes. The community had given more than enough to cover Mrs. Peterson's medical bills, not just for a few months, but for an entire year. People hadn't just donated money, they had donated hope. Veterans from other towns had pitched in. Local businesses, once hesitant because of HOA threats, had come through with large anonymous contributions. Even complete strangers, people who had only heard the story online, had sent money, messages of support, and offers to help. It wasn't just about Mrs. Peterson anymore. It was about every veteran who had been forgotten, every neighbor who had been bullied into silence, every community that had ever been strangled by power-hungry HOAs who thought they were kings of their little suburban fiefdoms. This was a reckoning. The next morning, the HOA held an emergency meeting. Tyler didn't attend. He didn't have to. The room was packed. Too many people had seen the videos. Too many neighbors were done being afraid. Jameson and Karen sat stiffly at the front of the room, faces pale, shoulders squared. They had walked in with their usual smug confidence, but it didn't last. Because the moment the meeting began, the floodgates opened. Homeowners stood up one after another, listing off every corrupt, petty, power-hungry stunt HOA had pulled over the years, the fraudulent fines, the intimidation, the way they had used the rulebook as a weapon instead of a guide. And now, they had tried to shut down a charity concert for a disabled veteran in front of hundreds of witnesses. With the video evidence already going viral, they didn't stand a chance. By the time the shouting had settled and the vote had been cast, Jameson and Karen had no choice but to resign. No fanfare, no last words. Just two people slipping out the back door, heads down, drowning in their own shame. Their reign of petty tyranny was over. Later that afternoon, Tyler went to visit Mrs. Peterson. She had already heard the news. The whole neighborhood had. She didn't say much at first, just poured him a cup of tea like she always did. But when she sat down, there was something different about her, a quiet strength, a new fire in her eyes. And then he saw it. The cane. Not the old, worn wooden one she had always used. A new one. Bold, sturdy, and bright red. Red, just like the uniform she had worn when she served her country. She ran her fingers over the handle, testing the weight of it, then met Tyler's gaze. "I'm done hiding," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "We deserve to be heard." Tyler felt something tighten in his chest. Because she was right, they all were.